Governor Andrew Cuomo has touted his Medicaid redesign team as an example of how traditional enemies can be brought together to solve a complicated state policy problem. But not everyone had a seat at the table where a $2.3 billion cost-cutting and reform plan was hammered out last week. And a number of groups that were impacted by the Medicaid team's proposals feel now that their views were not factored into the final report. Tonight we're joined by two people who have voiced some concerns to that plan. Brian Sampson is the executive director of Unshackle Upstate. He's upset with what he sees as a tax hike in the plan. And then we have Stephen Younger. He's joining us from New York City. He's the president of the State Bar Association, and he opposes changes to medical malpractice that are in this plan. So we're going to talk to both of them from opposite ends of the state. Thanks very much for your time tonight, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Brian, we're going to start with you.
Thank you.
And this is actually a bit of a departure because you and the business community have been very bullish on Governor Cuomo.
Sure.
In this instance, however, you are not thrilled.
Yeah, I think, overall, we're certainly pleased to see that there seems to be a spending reduction in Medicaid, that they're proposing a 4% cap. I think the one thing, though, that we're concerned about, and we heard very clearly from the governor, she doesn't want to balance the budget with new taxes and new fees.
Right.
But hidden into this proposal is about a $100 million increase on private insurers, that being all of us in the private sector, New Yorkers, that is concerning to us. New Yorkers already pay about $4 billion in taxes on our health insurance premiums. This is another $100 million, which, based on what we can see, could add as much as 2% to an individual's coverage.
Right, in a sort of trickle-down theory, if
Correct.
you will. And I would expect that, Steve, you're going to say much the same thing, except not on taxes, but what your issue is actually capping of medical malpractice payouts, lawsuits for victims, and that eventually that's going to hurt the people who are actually trying to be made whole. Is that correct?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, this was a bad process which produced bad policy. It was a behind-room, closed-door process made up only of the special interests, just the healthcare lobby. And the people who were victimized by bad doctors weren't at the table. But what it's producing is a recommendation that you take away rights of people and cap them so that someone whose life is taken away will get basically what today is the worth of a broken kneecap, $250,000. And that's just not good policy.
Okay, so a question to you, though. I mean, obviously, business was not at the table, and the the attorneys generally, the Bar Association was not at the table. Victims advocates, I actually have heard from some other folks on this particular topic earlier in the week, or last week too, were not at the table. But you can't get everyone around the table, of course, and I think that the devil's advocate, Steve, would say, well, don't the attorneys actually stand to lose a lot of money because they get the payout too, and attorneys are quite powerful, and their interests are represented when you look at the Assembly Speaker, Sheldon Silver. He is an attorney, is he not?
Well, there are really two questions there, Liz. The last time this was done, we were at the table. A prior governor put everybody at the table, and it was a good process. And it was an open air process. This was a closed-door process and a bad process. But when you talk about lawyers' fees, what the public doesn't understand is that to bring a medical malpractice case, the average lawyer, and I'm not a medical malpractice lawyer, invests $50,000 out of their own pocket. So just imagine if you cap the recovery at $250,000, these cases won't be brought. And that's just what the healthcare industry wants. They want an immunity from lawsuits. But if you have a bad doctor, they should stand up to justice just like everybody else.
So then the doctor would be personally liable and not the institution?
Well, right now the doctor is liable and the institution, but they're covered by insurance. And that's really what's going on here, because these tort awards aren't covered by Medicaid. This proposal won't save a dime in the state budget. Really what happened here was the team wants to give something to the hospital industry so they will support rate cuts. It's just a give back. It has nothing to do with the budget.
Okay, let's talk about, Brian, first of all, we should say probably that the business community is probably pretty pleased with anything that would keep down, writ large, with medical malpractice, or med-mal, as it's called here, reform.
Sure. I mean, we're a very litigious state, so anything that we can do on tort reform, I think, is a positive step.
Right.
Absolutely.
That said, though, the process, if you could speak to the process of, again, not being at the table for whatever reason that was. I mean, this MRT, as we're calling it, actually had public hearings all over the state. I mean, it was possible to weigh in. Do you believe the process was closed?
Well, I think you can certainly question, at least from an upstate perspective, we felt that there wasn't a whole lot of upstate representation on that committee, and we've heard throughout the course of the last few days that one very big industry wasn't represented, that being the home health insurance or home health aides. But
Right.
I think everybody had a chance to weigh in. Our perspective, again, was, Governor, you said you were going to do this with no new taxes and fees, and here we're looking at $100 million in taxes.
Right. So the
If
governor...
I could respond to that,
Please.
when you're told you're going to weigh in about Medicare reform, that's not tort reform. So we were not told until a week ago that this was tort reform. And we went to the governor's office, and what we were told, they didn't care about the policy issues. All they cared about was cutting money. You have to care about policy. You have to care about people's lives because they matter in our state.
Steve, let me just ask you, when you referenced the last governor who managed to do this, who was that?
Governor Spitzer.
Right. Right, that's what I thought. Okay, so this issue has been kicking around for a while, in fact. I mean, I just was reading an article from 1993 that spoke about Governor Cuomo and his efforts. We're not talking about this Governor Cuomo, we're talking about Mario Cuomo. I mean, this issue of Med-Mal has been around for a long time, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, the proposal that Governor Cuomo one put out, both sides, both plaintiffs and defendants, opposed. They didn't like the proposal, and I think that's why you need people from the justice community involved. We represent plaintiffs, defendants, upstate, downstate, 77,000 lawyers from across the state, and we oppose this proposal.
Okay, so let me ask this question, Brian, first to you and then Steve to you. What are you going to do about it? Because the governor said quite clearly at the Red Room press conference last week when this team came out, and he was very laudatory about this amazing process that had happened, bringing particularly two heavyweights, 1199 and the Hospitals Association, to the table, usually, banging him over the head with ads, not this governor, but past governors, not happening this year.
Right.
So he's clearly invested into this process. He said he's going to put it in the 30-day budget amendments. He calls on the legislature to pass it as is. What do you do now?
I think we have to go to the rank and file members and remind them that this is our position. Again, we're already looking at $4 billion of taxes on our health insurance as it is. It's a stress point for most of our employers. Therefore, it becomes a stress point for their employees and taxpayers in general. So we're going to educate them about the tax that's in there, encourage them to find ways to potentially take that out of the equation, because, again, we don't need to add new taxes and new fees onto New Yorkers.
But where do you make up the money?
Well, again, I think there were some other recommendations that people have looked at, just optional services that the federal government says you don't have to provide. We do provide them here in New York State. I think there's personal care that you can look at. Again, I think there's some other options that were out there that could save the $100 million. You didn't need to do it with a new tax.
Okay, Steve, Assemblyman Richard Gottfried initially said that he thought that it would be a non-starter, this Med-Mal piece of the Medicaid redesign team's plan. And then he subsequently was pulled back rather sharply. He abruptly made an about-face of his opposition. Do you believe that you're going to have difficulty finding allies in the legislature for your cause?
Well, we're hopeful that first the governor delinks these issues. This is not a budget issue. Medical malpractice reform is a substantive law issue. So we first asked the governor not to put this in the budget. Put it in a regular bill. But second, we are hopeful, and Speaker Silver has made some favorable comments. We're going to go to every legislator we can talk to. We've asked all of our members to do this because this is just bad policy.
Is it a possibility that you would sue over it?
I can't rule that out. I think if you read the Pataki v. Silver decision, if they decide to put it in a budget bill, it's very questionable.
Because, just elaborate on that for folks who can't remember that, that decision by the High Court in New York.
Yeah, the Court of Appeals gave the governor a lot of powers in the budget. However, they posed this hypothetical. They said, can you stick into the budget bill something that's just a personal injury concern, which was then the scaffolding law? And they suggested you couldn't do it.
Right.
I don't think this is any different because this doesn't save a dime. And as my colleague points out, it's going to actually cost money. It's going to cost business more money. And if you look at what they call the impaired baby bill, that's actually going to cost more money in Medicaid because those funds are not going to be made up by this new no-fault system. So Medicaid's going to end up bearing the cost.
So in the end, though, Brian, in case of this passage, I mean, the difficulty, of course, is that the legislature has trouble, again, because of the powers of the governor, in amending bills. And that's by putting something in a budget bill, it makes it harder for the legislature to amend it. The governor sounded like he was open to negotiations going forward. 30-day amendments are due at the end of this week. Right. Are you hoping that before the 30-day amendments are put in, that the language will change?
We would certainly hope so, but if at a minimum in the 30-day amendments we'd like to see some changes, there are some other things we'd like to see in those amendments as well. So it's certainly an opportunity for us over the next few days to continue to educate the rank and file members about the issues.
And what else would you like to see in those amendments?
We'd love to see the property tax cap put in there.
Of course, right.
Right. I mean,
Right,
it's
sorry.
a big issue for us.
I would think, Steve, that's not an issue for you, or is it?
Not a major issue for us, but if I could just make clear on the budget power,
Please.
the legislature does have the right to strike out or reduce an item in the governor's budget.
That's
so
true.
if Med-Mal is just stuck in there erroneously, it's irrelevant to this budget bill, they can strike it out. They can't add something new unrelated to the budget bill, but they can strike out things that are just not right.
Right. And then subsequently, the governor can't veto to put it back in. He could veto a
That's
whole
correct.
bill, correct?
He could veto the whole bill, or he could line item things he doesn't like. So
Right.
that's what we're going to ask the legislature to do.
Okay. And Steve Younger, I want to thank you very much for joining us. I just want to sneak in one quick question here that has to do with a completely different topic, and that's for you, Brian. It's on mandate relief.
Yep.
And I'm just curious if you are hearing anything, what your response is today from the mandate relief team. We're expecting some kind
Sure.
of report from them.
Well, we're hoping that it comes out today.
We haven't heard a word.
We haven't heard anything. I think, from our perspective, our number one issue this year has been the property tax cap. We need to find a way to control property taxes in New York State. We have an elected body that historically hasn't dealt with cost drivers in the system. We think the cap will do that. Once that cap is done, then we're going to move into the mandate relief. We do need to look at things that are driving up the costs for local governments and school districts. And, we keep hearing the doomsday scenarios of thousands of layoffs and classroom sizes
Right.
exploding. You have a Taylor law that is binding arbitration. You can make amendments to that law that says the terms of the last contract remain in effect until a new one is negotiated. You can have an ability to pay. It's an issue for NICOM. If the new contract adds to the cost of services, which means an increase in taxes or a decrease in services, ability to pay threshold has been set.
One of the problems here, though, is that Steve was bringing up the process that he felt was closed door from
Sure.
the Medicaid team. This team has done, and I said, well, there were public hearings, actually.
Sure.
This team has had almost zero public hearings.
Right. Yeah, and thankfully we've known a few people on there, and we've advanced our own recommendations on that. We did the double standard report. We made sure that they were aware of that.
Right.
We talked about Taylor and Triborough. We've talked about a new pension system, a Tier 6. That's a defined contribution plan, not a defined benefit plan that's guaranteed by the taxpayers. There are lots of things that can be done. But again, our fear is that they won't address them. What we'll get coming out of that is a watered-down version that isn't going to help us immediately, and it isn't really going to help us down the road unless that cap is in place to force those decisions.
Right. Well, what we've also heard is that this is a first step, a sort of intermittent step to an ongoing process, and not exactly the same thing that was coming out for Medicaid. We are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
It's good
Thank
to see
you.
you. And of course, Steve Younger, thanks very much. Brian Sampson, thanks.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Liz.